All right, good afternoon. No, we are running a bit late, so let's just get started. I'm Liongosari. I'm the Chief Research Scientist in Accenture Labs. Welcome to the Data Privacy, Policy, and Ethics panel. This is actually a really hot topic last year, and I'm going to continue this year, especially around IoT, right? So if you sort of think about IoT, IoT is about generating data. Now the question is actually, as you generate the data, how do you actually figure out what data that you can use? If you don't, how do you know exactly how to be able to get that information? Which part of the organizations that you be able to get the right set of information so you understand that there is a consent there, there's trust established as the information is being used. So I just want to quickly get a show of hand. How many of you have actually taken the car ride services out there? Just show of hand. All right, only very few. Wow, okay, to my surprise. In many countries, as you take the car ride services, one of the things that you do is actually you download the app, and by definition, actually you have a consent of, they'll be able to track where you are, where you're going, and the goal is to be able to find the right services for you, right? To be able to customize the services so they can improve that. Now, you actually go through that process, you may not realize that, let's say, you have some, for example, a medical condition that actually requires you to go to doctors, and you use right services to go to some specialists out there. By that definition, what actually they'll be able to track your location and very quickly correlates the location information, and with the doctor information, they can actually sort of implies what kind of treatments that you have or what kind of issues that you have from medical information about you. And suddenly, all the information about the car services quickly translate to medical information as well. So the boundaries between what is actually IoT information services that actually enhancing the experience that you have quickly turn into what are you originally not consent to. So the questions actually quickly turn into, do you have the right to know? Okay, what is the type of information that the companies has the right to know about you? So very hot topic. And what I actually want to do today is actually sort of discuss this, especially in the context of GDPR, that is actually sort of coming up in 7 months. We'd like to understand sort of how to operationalize this, how to think about it. And obviously, there's still a lot of questions on how to do that, but this is actually our time to talk about it, at least actually air some of the issues, what are some of the best practices out there. So today, we actually assembled 3 excellent panelists with very different background, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So what we're going to do is to spend a few minutes in the beginning to do the introduction, and then about 20 minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes, depending on how much time they get, just to be able to discuss this topic, especially sort of what actually implication of GDPR. And then we're going to open the floor. The whole point of this panel is actually to open up the floor to get input from you. Right? This is actually an issue that is the top of mind of many of you, so we'd like to actually get feedback. So prepare your questions as you hear the discussion that we have. Okay, with that, ask Giulio to introduce yourself.
Hi everybody, thanks Eddie. I'm Giulio Coraggio. I'm a partner at IGnPower. We are a global law firm, and I chair our global Internet of Things group. It's a really exciting timing for a technology lawyer. Everything is changing. The model of business of clients are changing. And so they have to face new legal issues. They are not prepared to that, and sometimes not even the law is prepared to that. So it's challenging for them, and it's challenging even for us as lawyers.
Great.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bassam Zarkout. I'm the founder of IGnPower, a company in Ottawa, Canada. I am a mechanical engineer by education, and I work in the petrochemical industry in the construction field. And I've also worked for a long time in technology in the field of the management of electronic records. I was CTO of a company in Geneva, Switzerland, focused on the governance of information. And for the past year, I have been focused on the governance of IoT data. And at the heart of the problem of governing the IoT data is the issue of privacy and how to manage that. So I'll be very happy to participate in the conversations today.
Thank you. Hello, and my name is John Grimm. I'm from Thales eSecurity, and I head up our IoT strategy. If you're not familiar with Thales eSecurity, Thales is a very large company that does very many things. The eSecurity part of the company that I'm a part of is a specialist in data protection, information security, with expertise in applied cryptography, so encryption, digital signatures, and the like, something that's very applicable in this world of privacy.
Well, welcome, gentlemen. So I'll start with Giulio. So if you're going to help us understand what is GDPR, why is it so special about that?
Well, the GDPR stands for the European General Data Protection Regulation, and as privacy lawyers, we think it's kind of revolution of the privacy. Up until I think a couple of months ago, privacy was just a pile of paper that no one was actually reading. It's written with really small fonts. You need to pick the right tick boxes. Did I select enough boxes? This was privacy for most of the people. Now, privacy with the GDPR becomes something that impacts your organization, the type of data that you need to process, and impacts quite a lot on the technology, the way your infrastructure, your technological infrastructure is processing that data. So it goes much more into detail, and indeed, as privacy lawyers, we need to have a large technical background. Our counterparties are no longer just the legal department of our clients, but most of the cases they are the technical department, the marketing department. We need to go into details on how the company process the data and how it should process the data from May 2018 when the law will be effective. And this law is so scary for everyone because it introduces very high sanctions up to the 4% of the global turnover or 20 million euros depending on whatever is higher. And, but it's not just the sanction. The fact that you can lose data, the personal data becomes the main asset of your company. The fact that a privacy authority can order to delete all the data that your IoT infrastructure has been collecting for years, then that creates a massive damage to your business and can impact even the future of the company.
And my understanding is that this is not restricted to just to your customer data, but the things that actually you capture around your employees, what actually happened, say, for factory floors and so forth. There's a lot of things that they
yeah, I mean, this is a very good point. In the world of the IoT, it's really important that a new regulation is even upcoming. It's still in the draft version. The e-privacy regulation will have a massive impact on IoT technologies. And the most interesting factor is that it applies also to machine-to-machine communications. So if I know information about a machine which might be indirectly connected to an individual, might not, which might just mean that the factory floor is efficient, is working properly, well, it seems like the European privacy authorities are trying to go beyond the field of just privacy compliance in order to attract any kind of flow data, which creates some issues because even up until yesterday, you were thinking that with M2M communications with industrial Internet of Things, you shouldn't have faced any kind of privacy concerns. And now privacy becomes an issue also for M2M communications. The regulation is still in draft, and I hope that they will take a step back. But to be honest, speaking to privacy regulators, they think that they need to control somehow any kind of data. And also, the European Commission is trying to introduce some changes to give even more control in the way that data is an asset, I want to keep control of that data under privacy regulations, under new types of copyright. They're even thinking about introducing a new IP rights to apply to data that is not personal data, but is still a value for the business.
Great. So Bassam actually can expand that even further on what exactly that means for IoT.
Yeah, first of all, the definition of personal data, to build on what Giulio said, the definition of personal data is much wider than the PII, the personally identifiable information. For example, data from your water meter at home can be an indication of whether you are at home or not. And if that is disclosed, if the pattern of you when you are at home or when you're not at home becomes available to other people, then that could lead to some issues. So the definition within the GDPR of personal data is very wide, and it also defines what you are allowed and not allowed to do with that data, how long you can keep it, whether and how you should delete it, who can access it, and whether the data subject, the human person who owns the data, who generated the data, has the right to request the deletion of the data or the portability of the data, which is you have to be able to deliver to that individual all the information you have collected about that. And one more restriction on the data is that your ability to use the data is limited to the nature of the business transaction you had with that individual. If you've collected data for the purpose of buying an air ticket, you cannot go and sell that data to another entity who could use it for some other purposes. And all of that implies a lot of changes at the technological level because most of the systems have not been designed with this privacy in mind. And there is a term now that is used in the industry more and more, which is privacy by design, which is when you are designing a new system, it has to be designed with privacy in mind. Just like when you build a building, you have to build it with safety in mind.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think if I can just add, the impact on the IoT technology is so critical because the IoT by nature is the combination of different suppliers. So no one is going to do the whole IoT product. It's the combination of products from different entities. And if I cannot, if I need to give a consent for strict single entity that is going to be in the pipeline, basically the product is not going to be usable at all. So what we're doing as kind of policymakers as well, we're trying to suggest to privacy regulators some kind of simplified consent form so that if there is an expectation from the side of the customer that the data will be circulated among the different entities that are behind the product, then a unique consent will be sufficient.
Great. All right, John, what do you think about from security perspective? What do you have to think about when I talk about GDPR? Obviously, build on what Bassam said around, the privacy by design, so security by design. How I can think that it's all intertwined there.
We've watched customers go on the journey to data protection over the years, watching an increased use of encryption as a very good example. GDPR very specifically calls out encryption as an appropriate measure and has the out clause for informing in the case of a breach if you've used it. The tough part of it is using it appropriately and well. The easy part is to find a piece of software that'll do encryption. Those are found anywhere. The easy part is to go find guidance on the good algorithms to use, how long the keys should be, how long you should use those keys based on how long they are. That's the easy stuff to find. The harder part, especially when the rubber meets the road down at implementation time, is to manage the keys that are associated with encryption. And as we've seen encryption become more pervasive and used in a kind of islanded or siloed way within enterprise, we've seen the struggles coming of managing the keys. And the trade-offs, you use fewer keys, you put more risk in the exposure of the data if a key is compromised. If you use a lot of keys, you might create yourself a management nightmare. And the opposite side of the offensive side of protecting data with encryption is encrypting and losing the key and therefore losing the data. So it's a tough balance, and many have struggled with it, But what I would emphasize in this GDPR journey is the proper implementation of encryption, managing keys well, and paying attention to the policies and procedures that surround the use of encryption, not just the simple checking of the box of doing encryption for encryption's sake.
Just to add one more element to what John said, and that is you need to think that the life cycle of this information may be many, many years, if not decades. A life insurance policy, you have to keep this information perhaps for the life of the client plus X number of years. So you have to look at the short term, but you also have to look at the long-term problem from storage, from protection, from encryption, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So if you okay, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add what is it, do you think that if the level of encryption is so high, it can turn personal data into non-personal data and allow somehow the transmission of data more freely? Because if I give the decryption key to, I don't know, to a public notary, to a trust, or to an entity on which I have no control, and basically no one else can turn the data into personal data, then in an IoT environment, I have much more freedom of doing without privacy law restrictions what otherwise would be quite restrained or limited.
Yeah. Those policies are the tricky part. How do you, it's relatively easy for you and I to figure out how to share a key securely and to share information, but as that community grows, it becomes harder and harder to have both the distribution of the key and the trust that every entity in that process will properly protect it. So that is a tricky part of the process, and requires proper policies and procedures surrounding how you create these things and manage them. Keys have long life cycles, and you made the point of the long life cycle of data, but the long life cycle of the key, as long as there's data encrypted in that key, you've got to keep the key around or you're never going to get it back.
And some keys may become orphan, as in the person assigned the key may no longer be part of the organization. So you have to worry about that aspect as well.
Right. So this is quite interesting, right? So, how actually going to be able to differentiate sort of the typical IoT system and enterprise system, especially in terms of key distribution. You're actually going to deal with a lot of devices out there, distributed, owned by different group of people. How do you actually sort of organize that?
This is where the IoT really departs from the old traditional enterprise, because so many of the enterprise assets had some level of protection provided by the environment they were in, the physical data center and the like, if you're talking about servers and computers. Now you've got IoT devices out at the unprotected edge, where they're subject to physical attacks, either something being plugged into them, an electromagnetic listening type attack where they try to pull the data out of it just by listening to the frequencies that the chipset inside the IoT device operates at. So it causes a rethink of the whole defense in depth model, and how do you provide those extra protections around the IoT device that now doesn't have a couple of the layers that many of the devices that you're used to protecting have, and building in extra mechanisms to watch for things, behavior-oriented things, for example, that you might not have otherwise thought were a major threat.
Right. And now all that goes to build up from your question, Bassam, about how actually we use the data, especially lineage of data. Where's the data come from? What is actually the type of consent that was originally given to begin with? But data change hands, and organization come and go. But there's actually sort of this set of data is actually available, and when you aggregate that, actually have a whole set of implications as well. How should people think about that?
Yeah, this is a very important question. The question of data lineage or chain of custody or provenance, depending on what industry you're in, has been a fundamental issue with electronic information for a very long time. With IoT specifically, because that information is being exchanged between systems over time and is being exchanged machine to machine, then it's difficult to track that information. And I've walked around the exhibit floor in the past few days, and I've been asking vendors, what are their thoughts about this? And the consensus is that the combination of encryption and pseudonymization, which is taking the approach of the numbered Swiss bank account, essentially, storing the controlled data in a separate place and use it using an artificial code in the transaction goes a long way to ensuring that the data, important data, does not get leaked. But at some point, the data has to be signed and those signatures have to be tracked so that if the information is found somewhere else, then you have a way of tracing it back to its source.
Yeah, also in the light of the principle of accountability, that is another principle behind the GDPR, you need to prove to have done what is required under privacy law to become compliant. So the burden of proof is not on the privacy authority that comes knocking at your door and saying, well, I think that you did something wrong. They're going to come to your office and say, prove me that you did things properly. And so just coming back to what you were saying, tracking the consent is crucial, because if I'm not able to justify the legal basis under which I'm processing that data, basically the consequence is that I'm processing illegal data. If I'm processing data for longer than what is required, this is something that I would say 99% of my clients are doing. They have no policy on the storage of data. They just keep data for as long as they can, because somehow data acquired on day one might become more exploitable on day 10 because I develop a new technology. The GDPR requires a new complete approach on data. Data is definitely value in your company, but it can be a kind of ticking bomb in your company because it can put in danger all the financial stability of the business.
Yeah, so sort of build upon that, one of the issues that I see is that, people talking about consent, right? So I'll take Facebook as an example, with the evolution of the contents, there's new features actually coming out, and then you have to sort of give consent on what kind of information is available, but it has become very cumbersome over time, right? So if everything that you use the data for and you have actually to get consent all the time, and eventually it becomes a hindrance for people to use the app itself. What actually people should be thinking about? How to actually sort of frame that in a way that is useful, people understand actually what the thinking behind use of the information, and yet actually useful, right? So, be able to actually get that friendliness from the application itself. Any thoughts there?
I think we need to work on a culture of data. At the moment, ticking different boxes on Facebook is just something annoying for most of the users, and they're not going to even read what is written there.
Exactly.
But even the negative press on, cyber attacks that can happen to entities, even public entities that have our personal data, then they create a culture of the value of the data. When we get something for free, basically we're not getting anything for free, we're just selling our data to the supplier that is selling on that data to other entities. So I think that in an environment where we're switching to a model of business based on the sale of a product to the sale of a service, we will understand, and everyone will understand, that what we're actually selling is our profile, and that has a value for someone at the end of the pipeline.
So along that line, I'll build up, so what's like the best practices that you see, in this space, right? Where there's like a sort of consent, use of data, the sort of the companies or the apps, what have you, that you can actually point to this cycle, sort of the team here cycle should be thinking about.
Well, I think that the multi-layer consents are one viable option. I give one consent that gives me a broader picture of what I'm consenting for. And then if I want to go more into detail and I want to opt out to some specific sub-consents to entities that are within the pipeline of the IoT product, I can do it. Just following the example of what we are looking at with the cookies policies on any European website. It's really boring because we need to tick one box and then we can go further behind the policy and untick some boxes on the website. The same approach should be taken in relation to IoT technologies. If I get one single consent that gives me a broader understanding in a plain language of what I'm consenting for, but then I need to be able to control much more in detail what, where my data is going.
Great. Bassam?
I think one of the first steps in the organization is to establish this privacy program and to conduct what is called the data protection impact assessment or privacy impact assessment, depending on where you're coming from. And the result of that assessment will give you an idea about where your data is stored, what is going through the data pipes, and what data is being exchanged in these business processes. And the overall strategy should be based on the minimization of data. You should not exchange more data than what is necessary, so that later on, things are a lot easier to comply with than if you were collecting an excess amount of data and then now you have to go back and request consent every time you need to perform a certain transaction. So the data protection impact assessment is a very crucial first step in the process so that you know where you stand, and that allows you to define your strategy.
And just to build on one of your points there, discovery of data is something that we find organizations really tend to struggle with. And the worst thing you can do from the security point of view is protect the data in one place and leave it exposed in other places. The ultimate false sense of security, because every good attack that's written out there is made to go look for the easier target. If you find something, you can't get to it, and you've made your way in, you move laterally until you find something easier. So that discovery piece cannot be underestimated. A lot of folks struggle.
Yeah, the banks have a process called KYC, Know Your Customer. What we're talking about here is Know Your Data, KYD. You need to know your data. You need to know what you have and where is that data going, where is it stored, how long is it being kept, and so on and so forth.
And it's important also to be able to fix any potential hole in your security environment, because there is no software without bugs, and therefore you need to be able to remotely control what you built and just to implement the correction. I mean, we have the example of Tesla. Each time they find a bug, they do an upgrade remotely without calling the cars to the plant and so on. This is the best solution, and it should be implemented in relation to any kind of IoT technology.
Great. So I'm going to go to the next question, but before I do that, I'm going to open up, after these questions, we're going to open up the microphone to the floor. So get ready to any questions. There's actually a floating microphone somewhere here. So just raise your hand when you have questions there, all right? So my next question is actually more along the line that we just discussed, like how are we going to operationalize it, right? So what are the process? We actually have to pinpoint one specific things that the audience can take away on looking at this privacy, the ethical use of the data. What will that be? If you actually have very specific things that you can offer to the audience here.
I start? Okay, the starting point needs to be a clear understanding that privacy is not confidentiality. Privacy is transparency. So you need to disclose to your clients, to your employees, what you're actually doing with that data. It seems very straightforward, but in an IoT environment, it's really, really complicated. And this means not only to write privacy information notice more in detail, but to know where the data is. What you were saying that mapping the data into the system and being able to control the potential flows of data is crucial. That's important because it needs to be reflected into the information that you disclose to your customers, you disclose to the authorities in case of checks. And you need to be able, through your internal technologies, through a data management system, you need to be able to control the data within your system. So if a data portability request comes to your company, you need to be able to port all the data. If there is a request of access, you need to be able to identify the data in your system, which seems easy, but it's getting more and more complicated.
I think we can draw a lot of analogy and inspirations from industrial safety. I have a colleague who works with an oil company, and safety is so ingrained in their culture that this oil company, when you walk down the stairs, even in the building, not on the platform, in the building, when you walk down, you have to hold the guide rails, and this is a fireable offense. So they have instilled the culture of safety within the organization. So what we are talking about here, this is not a project. This is a program within the organization that has to have a stakeholder. So I think one of the first steps is to make sure that this program is created, is properly supported by a senior executive, and then you can take them to the next levels. And obviously the technology side is one aspect of that work.
And I would add to that consistency of policy. So one of the areas we see people struggle a lot, especially as they start to protect their data on their different systems, their SAP system, their Oracle system, et cetera, is that they have difficulty achieving consistency of policy, assuming they've created the policy that they wish to have, to instantiate that across multiple systems that have multiple GUIs, multiple interfaces, and handle things differently. So the centralization, as much as possible, can help you achieve that level of consistency and therefore actually implement the policy you're going for, rather than having islands that are inconsistent in their protection profiles.
Yeah. One more comment. By the way, the fact that GDPR is a law that applies to all EU jurisdictions, that makes life a lot easier than other kinds of regulations where you have to worry about the variations in each jurisdiction. Now, in GDPR, there are some aspects of it which may be customized by each country, but by and large, it's a consistent law across all the jurisdiction, and that will simplify the task to a certain extent.
Well, that's a big open question, because the local authorities are somehow issuing their own guidelines, and so consistency might turn into inconsistency. Just to add that it's not relevant just for European companies, it's also relevant for non-European companies that have business in Europe. Even if they run their European business remotely from the US, from Asia, somewhere else, if the customers here, they will be impacted by the GDPR.
Great. So with that, I'll open up the microphone to the floor. Any questions? Raise your hand. Yep, this gentleman in the blue shirt here. Yep.
I don't know if this microphone works.
Go ahead.
Thank you for a balanced discussion, and to add a little bit to the balance, as a former European Commission director in this field, perhaps adding to it that you have the GDPR, you have the e-privacy regulation, but the e-privacy regulation starts from the point of view that confidentiality of communications is very important. As a matter of fact, it's a fundamental right. And this is not necessarily only communication of personal data, but also of business data. And logically, in an IoT environment, you would actually want that indeed the communication from the devices of business relevant data is also protected, because that can actually be your intellectual property or your competitive advantage or whatever. So the starting point is actually, if you read the e-privacy regulation, is confidentiality of communications. And there, of course, there are techniques like encryption that you can apply. But actually, I have a specific question, which is more to the consent issue. And again, thanks for a balanced discussion on that. So if the purpose of what you want to do with the personal data is changing, you have to ask again for consent. Let's simplify it, if really the purpose changes. Now, people say that is a burden, but could you also look at it as a form of an advantage? Because actually it brings you back to the customer. So it's another point of contact with the customer about probably a changed or increased functionality. I'm with the speakers that the way business is presenting that is often very confusing, and you don't know what you are signing up to, but perhaps that's just not fully exploiting the advantage of having another contact with the customer about a service which will be enhanced based upon another purpose for the personal data. So what do you think about consent as an opportunity?
Anybody want to take that?
Well, I'm not saying that consent doesn't need to be given. I'm just saying that in an IoT environment, there are so many different entities. If I need to give a separate consent for each entity that is part of the IoT environment, then it's not an opportunity, a single point of contact. It's a really time-consuming and it's impacting the quality of the product. Because I'm just going to spend my day taking different consents without even reading the information. And this will be in contrast with one of the principles of the GDPR. The GDPR requires that privacy information notices need to be clearly understandable. If I have just a list of tick boxes to click, I'm just going to read through them very quickly without even maybe paying attention to anything, so it will not fit the purpose, while a multi-layer privacy information notice, as I was saying before, will fit the purpose.
I'm not sure that that is what the law says, what you just suggest. So it's not necessarily so that the law tells that you have to click for each and every individual item in your system stack.
Yeah.
So perhaps this is actually something that the industry can look at. How can you do this in a smart way, so that indeed you're right, it is understandable, it's simple, it's also honest, so to say. And perhaps that's also the leeway that the law offers to do that.
I think this is really interesting, and I've been actually sort of pondering personally on myself in terms of, how actually it's evolved, especially, given the technology change, we have the data. Sometimes actually we discover some usefulness of the data that go beyond our original intention collecting the data. And now we have to sort of go back and figure out what is actually sort of best way to actually that consent. I think that's a serious opportunity, and somebody actually to crack this, to be able to pull together something that's a little more cohesive, allow people to evolve, actually have this some level of understanding, highly personalized, obviously, but actually get you, for example, you can go back to the fact that I did actually have a consent. This is what I consent to and how it evolved, right? Some level of transparency that pull it all together, so I know where actually even to go to if I want to actually investigate what I consent to. I think that's actually sort of something that, we as like a whole community need to crack and make that happen.
The level of granularity of the consent there has to be a balance between what you need to do and what is practical from a level of understanding of the consumer of that information. There is no, I think, simple answer to that question, but it's an important issue, yeah.
Other questions? One more. If there is no questions, then I'll just add on to this. So, if for this particular audience, given that this is, the GDPR is actually coming, there's actually other laws coming, what are the things that you actually have to, the group, when actually look at the IoT, looking at the data, the consistent of a policy, consistent of the processes that we actually sort of talk about, how do you see that actually all will come together? Do you see that there's a tool, the process, culture, education? How do you see that all coming together?
Well, I think that the three pillars are information, organization, and technology. Information in the sense that you need to add a better control of the data, and know what data you are processing. Organization, you need to create a culture of the data within your company. You need to train them. You need to put in place some organizational checks in order to make sure the data is processed properly. And you need to make sure that people within the company understand that they're putting the company at risk if they don't process data properly. In technology, because in an IoT environment, you cannot think that you are able to control any data without the support of technology, and so technology needs to be able to keep a control along all the pipeline.
We should also remember that on the business side and on the IT side, those teams as well have GDPR requirements, and they have an ongoing process to achieve GDPR compliance. So an alignment between those two efforts has to be established, because the policies are not going to be enormously different. So there has to be an alignment between all the GDPR compliance activities within the organization on the IoT side as well as on the business side.
And I would add that the awareness of the life cycle of data and the accounting for changes that happen in places over time. And certainly the IoT, if I think of manufacturing environments where they've been drawing data from sensors on their production lines for years and years, but it's been in a much more closed environment. Now as you open that up or you make a connection for the purpose of sharing that data to have a broader analysis view on it, you have to think about whether those devices were designed to be in an environment like that in the first place, and what do you need to put in place to shield them now that there's a change to that environment. So I think the life cycle and the change vectors of the IoT are the big considerations.
Very typical IT-OT conversation, I think.
Wonderful. With that, I think we are running out of time. Thank you for joining us, and please join me thanking these excellent panelists.
Yeah.